I'm not an attorney. I'm not that familiar with antitrust laws, although I do have what I would consider an understanding of what they're meant to be. And my understanding is that antitrust laws basically deal with trying to stop corporations from forming monopolies over certain portions of the market. And the agreement that we're asking the bankers to sign is not an agreement to establish a monopoly or a commonality between all the banks and all of their common rates. What we're asking is a commonality within each bank, so that each bank, using whatever ratios they want to establish, give the suburbs and the inner city a fair break. So I don't think that would really fall under the definition of a antitrust suit or a question of establishing a monopoly. I think that, or the coalition believes that the most effective way that the city can take a very open stand in solving the redlining issue is by establishing a public review board which would be visible.
Segregation in Seattle is almost as old as the city. The first victims were Chinese people who came to the city and were quickly contained in an area that now is marked as Chinatown. As Japanese immigrants followed, they were also corralled into what is now the International District. In the 1920s, segregation became more official, more a legal process as the African American population began to expand. The mechanism that was created to legally require people to stay in certain areas were something called restrictive covenants, mentioned here in an article in a left-wing newspaper in 1948. Restrictive covenants were legal documents. There were deed restrictions that prevented anybody from, of certain designated categories from living in a house or an apartment. Here are some of them. The Civil Rights Project has collected more than 400 of these for neighborhoods all around King County. You can see the area that was not restricted on the map produced by the left-wing publication. This distinctive L-shaped ghetto was where virtually all African Americans lived, almost all Asian Americans, and most of the Jewish population of Seattle. So here are some of the covenants. The distinctive language often mentioned that no property shall be inhabited as well as bought or sold, except, in this one it says, except a domestic servant or servants who may actually and in good faith be employed by the white occupants. Some of the covenants included Jewish people named Hebrews in this covenant from Ballard, Sunset Hills. And there was also often very distinctive language, various sort of anthropological science language at the time. So Malay refers to Filipinos. Ethiopians was this sort of pseudo-scientific language that supposedly designated all people of African heritage. Discrimination, racial discrimination remained fully legal, completely, absolutely legal until 1968. We're coming up on the horrifying anniversary, 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th. Shortly after that, the laws were changed. As cities exploded in misery and violence, Congress rushed through the Fair Housing Act, and the City Council of Seattle produced its own ordinance, finally saying that it's illegal to discriminate in rental or sale of housing. So, 68 marks a turn. I want to now take you through a quick survey of how segregation has been reorganized in the 50 years since then. So these are maps from the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, but this map shows the percentage of African American residents in each census tract, and this is the percentage of Asian American or Pacific Islander in each census tract. And that, for those in the back, these numbers up here are pretty close to zero. Here's the L-shaped ghetto. And for Asian Americans, it was pretty much the same, except Japanese American families, some of them had started moving into Beacon Hill. 1970, now discrimination is supposedly illegal, but not much is going to change for quite a while. What does happen is that there's some movement into the south of the ghetto area for both African Americans and a little more distinctively for Asian Americans into Beacon Hill and now Rainier Valley. 1980, that trend, that southward turn, accelerates somewhat, but still most of these areas that are marked here in white have 0 to 1% Asian American or African Americans. 1990 is when the map starts to change for the first time. Now the population of Asian Americans is growing. The immigration laws have allowed immigration again, and so Asian Americans by 1990 have outnumbered African Americans. And you can see that the process of southern movement out of the CD for African Americans is now being pushed as well as pulled. It's pushed by the gentrification process, which is pretty strongly underway by 1990. And for Asian Americans also moving south, but now also to some extent on the east side and some into North Seattle. Jump 20 years to 2010. I'm not going to talk about this map. I'm going to break up the neighborhoods a little bit so you can see what's happened. And these numbers maybe are visible. So this is North Seattle and the percentage of African American residents in each census district. And North Seattle remains today the least affected by any of the processes of desegregation. It's still overwhelmingly white. Used to be 99.1% white, now it's 75.2% white. There are very few African Americans still north of the Ship Canal, only about 3%. More Asian Americans and Latinos, but this is the least affected, the least desegregated part of Seattle, along with northern suburbs and to some parts of the east side. Here's the Central District, which has been totally transformed over the last 20 years through processes of gentrification. These numbers actually are already out of date. The last 7 years have seen the gentrification process accelerate. But you can see the turnover here, a district that once was majority black, 54% in 1960. Now it says 22% in 2010, but we're probably down to about 17%. And whites are a majority in these 7 classic census districts that used to be thought of as the Central District, the heart of African American life in Seattle. And where people have gone, of course, is southeast in particular, down the Rainier Corridor into southeast Seattle and then below to Renton and Kent and southern King County. And you can see this is the area that is kind of most interesting, most transformed. It's where Seattle comes together. It's still maybe close to 30% white, close to 25% black, Asians more than a third, lots of Latinos. So this is the one area that seems to say Seattle can desegregate, whereas so many of the other parts of the city have not. Technically, redlining refers to a process of discrimination against neighborhoods. Redlining is less of a problem nowadays. Racial discrimination is absolutely a huge problem. So what does this refer to? In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Authority was created, the FHA, to make loans available on mass level to Americans so that we would become a homeowner nation. And millions of Americans were given federal loans to buy houses. The FHA decided to map cities to indicate which neighborhoods the FHA would support with loans and which neighborhoods were seen as hazardous and declining, in which case no federal loans would be available. and those neighborhoods are marked in red, hence the term redlining. This is the 1936 Seattle map, and as in other cities, virtually any neighborhood that had people of color would automatically be marked as red. So the effect of this was to lock in and reproduce and emphasize and accelerate segregation, but it had this double effect of degrading the neighborhood's ability to kind of replenish housing. Since no loans could be made, or very few, or it was hard to get a loan, there was a kind of double tax on the people who lived in a redlined neighborhood. The fight against redlining had gone on all along, but accelerated in the 1970s when in cities like Seattle, civil rights organizations took on the call to end this kind of discrimination, to stop lenders from refusing to make loans in neighborhoods. And you can see here a study, a report by the Central Seattle Community Council Federation decrying redlining and vowing to do something about it. Now the good news is that the city responded. Pretty liberal administration took on redlining, passed various kinds of rules to govern banks and others, and to force them to make loans in all neighborhoods. So the banks stepped up and said, okay, we'll do it, and began making loans in the Central District. Well, guess who got the loans? So this was the paradoxical dimension of the fight against redlining. Many of the loans went to whites, white families buying homes in the Central District. So the fight against redlining fueled gentrification in ways that the activists of the 70s didn't anticipate. Redlining, if we mean race discrimination, we should say race discrimination. If we mean redlining, that's about neighborhoods, but the race discrimination is very, very serious, needs to be attended, needs to be criminalized. It needs to be ended.
But given that my family moved to Seattle from the South in 1950, and the impacts of redlining at that particular time was actually a positive impact because they didn't have to find their place in the city of Seattle. They found their place easily because that was the only place they could go. And so they found other friends, they found people that they knew who had moved here from Arkansas, and they created community. I remember growing up in a place that was really robust, that was full of black businesses, that was a point and place of pride. And today, I live in a place that feels like it's being completely and totally demolished, reconstructed, recreated for people who are not like me. And so it's kind of that place of, you know, again, it's my black pain on display in many ways, and I have to live it. Not just in the exterior, but in my interior, because I feel like I'm under attack on a daily basis. So it's a really interesting kind of PTSD position to be in, you know, to think about the history of redlining, the history of housing covenants, and institutional and systemic racism. Mm-hmm. We're talking about segregated Seattle as if it was something in the past, too. Right. And Seattle's about to become incredibly more segregated again, because only rich white people are going to be able to live in the city of Seattle. If we continue to go at the pace that we're going right now, I mean, the numbers don't lie.